to share with us. So, our sermon series is called Visible Women. We're exploring female Bible characters. So, Nicki, I would love to pray for you, and then I'll hand over to you. Yes, Lord, I just thank you for Nicki. I thank you for her courage and her boldness this morning. I just pray for a filling of the Holy Spirit, Lord, that she would just feel completely at peace and share with comfort and joy. And Lord, I pray that you would open our hearts, our minds, our spirits, and our ears to receive your message and your love for us this morning. Amen.
Okay, here we go. Okay, hi. I'm not going to reintroduce myself, but I'm Nicki. I will talk a little bit about some of my background. So I have some background in preaching. I worked as a pastoral intern for a university ministry that I kind of came up in after I had graduated. And then I was a leader in the last church we were part of. We kind of helped Sean and I plant that church. And so that church actually had this cool thing that lined up with the values of CC, like I mentioned in my introduction. We called these small groups that we had every other Sunday family groups. And the idea of that was like to have a more intimate setting every other Sunday that you could be in. And it allowed people who might not be comfortable being up here like me or sharing at the mic to bring something to a much smaller group. So today I'm going to be kind of sharing two things from a family group that we did on this woman that I'm focusing on today, the bleeding woman who touched Jesus. When Naomi asked me if I wanted to speak on this series, I immediately thought of that family group, and partially that was because there were just several elements brought that I think really brought her story to life, and I wanted to share a few of those with you guys today. So let me see. So there are many women in the Bible. They all, have beautiful stories. I think this particular one about the bleeding woman is such a powerful example of what faith is. And she's not even named, which I think is sad but interesting. So I just wanted to give her some visibility today. The story is pretty short, especially depending on which gospel you read the account from. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each varying in detail. I'm going to read from Mark today because I think it records two different details together that are intriguing and important. But before I read the scripture, I want to set the scene a little bit about where we are, where Jesus' ministry is. He's already begun his ministry. He's healing, he's casting out demons. Just before this, Mark talks about Jesus casting out the many demons, legion, from the man into a herd of pigs. Don't think that made people very happy, so he started to gain some notoriety, for better or worse. And our story picks up in Mark 5. Jesus was walking, followed by a large crowd and his disciples, and the synagogue ruler, Jairus, stops him and asks him to come heal his sick daughter. So I'll pick up in verse 25. The verse should be on the screen if you guys want to follow along. It says, "A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a lot under the care of many doctors and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Because she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Her bleeding stopped immediately, and she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. At that very moment, Jesus recognized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' His disciples said to him, 'Don't you see the crowd pressing against you, yet you ask who touched me?' But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward, knowing that what had happened to her. She fell down in front of Jesus and told him the truth. He responded, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease." So there's a lot of cool things happening here. But before we talk about this passage, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to immerse yourselves in this story a little bit more. And I'm going to be sharing a few things from that family group I mentioned. The first one is a painting done by my friend April. She, when preparing to help tell the story in family group, felt like she had a clear vision from God on what she should paint. She's not usually a painter, she's a photographer. But she first painted the canvas in black and then slowly covered or washed over the black with white. The red cloth represents the woman and is slightly lower on the canvas because she pictured her crawling low in humility. The cloth is also the only group named Cassidy. Doctor after doctor, the element on the canvas because this woman's small, brave act is the focus of the. All of their words and suggestions have started to blur together over the last 12 years, the story. So I just want you guys to kind of like take that in as I read. Try this, eat that, eat less of that, bathe in this, pray to that God. This retelling of the story from the woman's perspective, written by another friend of mine from that family. Hike up that mountain, drink water from this river. I've spent all my money on these doctors, and yet I continue to grow worse. I eventually become numb to the frustration and the embarrassment that leaving these appointments with no solution in sight brought on. I was long ago declared an outcast for an ailment I can't control. Mother, father, brother, sister, friend, and lovers have stopped coming by ever since society deemed me unclean. I'm not sure how I can be deemed unclean for something I can't control, but I don't really get a say in the matter and continue to count my blessings that I'm just an outcast and not killed. I continue to hope, for word has traveled even to the outcast that there's a man who performs miracles. There are stories that he turned the blind to seeing, the sick to healed, and the lost to found. Surely, if those stories are true, if he can do those things for those people, he could do the same for me. Finally, the day has come. Jesus is not too far from me. I've waited for weeks in anticipation. I start the trek to the next town over where he's rumored to be. Despite the heat, I put on multiple layers so that the other townspeople cannot see that I'm unclean. Large lines have formed in every direction, seeming to meet at the middle of the town where I can see a man standing. This must be Jesus. Suddenly, a man approaches Jesus and converses with him. Jesus starts to walk away. I cannot miss this chance. I rush through the crowd of people, being careful not to press into them. I can't see over the crowd anymore, but I keep pushing through. Eventually, the crowd of pushing people parts just enough to where I can see a man in the middle of the circle walking among the crowd with a group of men he was talking to. Not wanting to make this man deemed unclean, but hoping and praying that this miracle would work, I speed up my pace to slip in right behind Jesus and reach out and touch the very end of his cloak. Almost instantly, Jesus stops his walking. Who touched me? My ears are ringing. I'm suddenly filled with terror and joy. I can feel in my body for the first time in 12 years that the bleeding has stopped. A man walking closely with Jesus turned to him and scoffed, "Master, we're walking in a crowd of people. Dozens have touched you." Jesus continues to search the faces in the crowd. Someone touched me. I felt the power go out of me. His eyes land on me. Still trembling, I make the conclusion that I need to confess. I could not steal this miracle away from this man. I step out toward Jesus and get on my knees, preparing to beg for my life. I explain my story, how I've been bleeding for 12 years and used all my resources and on doctors and never found a cure. But I had heard that he could perform miracles, and I knew I needed to meet him or touch him to be cured. I finally make eye contact with Jesus again, and when I touched your cloak, the bleeding stopped. Instead of the usual disgust or revulsion or pity in his eyes, I only see compassion. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Okay, so I chose to include this retelling of the story from the woman's perspective because I think it really helps her to be seen and gives her story weight in life, which is what this series is all about. There's so many women mentioned in the Bible, but when I went through the list, some of them that really stood out to me were the ones who were either briefly mentioned or not named. Who were they? What was their story? I've been reading a book called Inspired by Rachel Held Evans. It reminded me of someone shared some books during our sharing time that really have helped them step out of some of legalism, and her book has really done that for me. So I highly recommend it. She mentions this tradition in the Judaism faith called Midrash. I'd not heard of this before, but she explains that it's an imaginative exploration and expansion of Scripture that serves as the most common form of biblical interpretation in Jewish tradition. And this retelling really feels like that to me. It's an imaginative exploration of the Scripture, getting perhaps a small glimpse into this unnamed woman's life. So, I said at the beginning we can find the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is intriguing to me. I think we get a really cool picture when the Gospels all tell one story with varying detail and perspective. Each version of the Gospels brings in like a different element or detail, and I think this retelling blends them all together nicely. I'm going to be focusing primarily on Mark's version, but there are two things that Mark touches on that I think are important. But if we read Matthew's version, which is quite different from Mark and Luke's, we get this interesting verse. So we have the woman, she's thinking to herself, if I just touch Jesus, I'll be healed. And immediately after that, in verse 22, it says, Jesus turned and saw her and said, take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you. And the woman was healed at that moment. This kind of makes me think maybe she didn't get a chance to touch Jesus, that he caught her in the act. But he knew immediately to address her, and he saw her. So with my friend's permission, I added one tiny line to her retelling. I added the part where it says, his eyes land on me, after Jesus asked who had touched him. As a woman, sadly, in church, my voice, my story has often been hushed. I've been told by a family member that I would be living in sin for speaking to you as I am today. So for me, it's really easy to relate to this woman after hearing a story like this. Easy to feel isolated from family because of something I can't control, as if my biological sex makes me unclean or unworthy of being heard in certain church spheres. At the end, we'll open up the mic so we can hear how this retelling has affected you or some thoughts. But first, I want to talk about the two details that Mark brings in to the story. So in Mark's version, he notes the thought that the woman has, that she just needed to touch Christ to be healed. And he also notes Jesus recognizing the power in him. The other two Gospels tend to pick one of these details, but not both. We see Christ healing people many different ways throughout his ministry, but only two other times that we know of does Jesus tell the person that their faith has made them well. This is the only healing we find in the Bible where Jesus takes an almost more passive role, healing without first being asked. This is the first thing that really stands out to me about this woman. The woman touched him and power leaves him. She didn't request healing first. The disciples mentioned that so many people must have touched him. He was walking in the crowd. Yet her touch drew power. Did her faith activate it somehow? We see the lack of faith hindering or dissuading Jesus from healing. In Mark 6:5, Jesus leaves Nazareth and it says, he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. So something about this woman's faith is the key component to her healing, as Christ says. The second thing I find interesting in Mark's version, the second thing I found interesting about the story is, as I mentioned before, there are two other instances where we see Jesus heals people and mentions that their faith is what heals them. So we have the story of the 10 lepers in Luke 17:19. And we have the story of the blind man who calls out to Jesus in Luke 18:42. In the story of the lepers, there's 10, and only one leaves his friends to come back to Jesus and thank him. And Jesus tells him, your faith has made you well. The story of the blind man, he can't physically go to Jesus, so he calls out to Jesus, and people around him try to hush him and quiet him down. But Jesus comes over to him and he says, your faith has made you well. I think in each of these we find something unique. We find action taken on part of the healed, and the bleeding woman's no different. We see the one of the 10 lepers physically leave his friends, probably the only people he's been allowed to interact with for a while, to come back to Jesus and thank him. And then we see this blind man who can't take maybe a physical action, but he calls out to Christ over and over. And the bleeding woman's no different. She ventures out to find Jesus at great risk to herself. She's bleeding for 12 years. I'm going to put Leviticus up on the screen, Leviticus 15:25 through 27. And it says, when a woman has discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. In verse 26, it says, any bed she lays on, anything she sits on will be unclean. And verse 27, anyone she touches will be unclean. So we know from this that in Jewish culture, she was an outcast. Anything or anyone she touched basically would have caught her uncleanliness. So this is over a decade of her being a social pariah, most likely isolated from those she knew and loved, as the retelling kind of maybe shows us. We aren't sure how she made money or took care of herself, but we do know that what money she had, she spent on doctors who made it worse. So she hears about Christ. Again, we don't know what exactly she heard, but something inside her believed that just the smallest touch from him, maybe the first human touch she's initiated in over a decade, would heal her. And she went and acted on that belief. She risked being in a large crowd, which probably could have gotten her in trouble, to simply touch the robe of this man, Jesus. I'm reminded of the verse James 2:14 through 17. I'm going to have that on the screen if you guys want to read along on that with me. And I'm reading from the Common English Bible translation because I think it really hits the nail on the head. It says, my brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say that they have faith but do nothing with it? Claiming to have faith can't save anyone, can it? Imagine a brother or sister who's naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful action. This woman was a victim of an illness, and no one would have faulted her for giving up many years prior. Yet instead, she had faith that moved her into faithful action. It moved her to seek Christ and the healing she believed he could offer. I think this is such a beautiful picture of what faith is. So many people in that crowd must have touched Jesus more than the simple brush of his clothes like this woman did, but her faith makes the touch different. Oftentimes, I think, and I'm guilty of this in the past, think we view faith as getting things right or believing the right thing. And here we see that idea dismantled. We see a desperate woman take a risk, acting on a belief, and that act, that vulnerability, brings her to Christ and to healing. If she had anyone in her life, they probably would have warned her against going, especially seeking to touch someone, because that would have been against the law. I think back to my own life and the times when I've felt the Spirit's leading. Oftentimes, not only my own fear, but the fear of those around me, the fear of those who are also supposed to be God followers, have tried to work against my faithful action. So I mentioned this a little bit, but just after graduating university, I felt this nudge to take a risk. I felt called to work as a pastoral intern with the ministry that I had attended as a university student. I really wrestled with this idea because it meant that I would have to preach as a woman. And my family, who had raised me to follow the Lord, had very strong opinions about that being wrong. Some of them even confronted me on it and urged me not to do this internship. So I had to choose. I had to choose to stay where I was in this familiar place of safety and timidity, or to step out and take a risk. A risk that I might very well be wrong. My family could be right. I didn't have all the answers. Many biblical scholars who are much smarter than me have landed on different sides of this issue. All I had was this nudge from the Spirit, and I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't ignore that pull and greater risk of not following the Spirit's leading. So I did the internship, and I preached, and I did ministry with and amongst youth students. And though that year was extremely hard, I learned so much about myself and discipleship, and most importantly, Christ's character. And it's still one of the richest years I've experienced following Christ. The risk paid off. So we're going to open up the mic in a minute for thoughts on how the story has affected you. But I want to leave you with a question to just sort of think about this week. What actions is the Spirit prompting you to take? What or even who is keeping you from moving? As we see from this woman, having all the answers is not faith, but rather having the willingness to take a risk, to take action, and to follow the Spirit without all the answers is. So we're going to open up the mic. Feel free to come and talk about, just share anything how this retelling was helpful for you or challenging or anything like that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicki. That was really inspiring. So the mic is open just to my right-hand side. And if you're on Zoom, if you feel free to pop the comment in, we can read them out, and I'll just get it started because we've had a comment already. So this is from she says, "I love this retelling tradition. I think it brings us so much closer to these people and helps us draw closer to God when we understand the day-to-day of their lives and how God has impacted it. I also think it sharpens our own skills of empathy and bridging differences to see the common humanity in all of us. And that's such an important ability as a Christian and can be really difficult. This was really rich. Thank you, Nicki."
Forgive me having 2 bites of the cherry so quickly. But Nicki, I just want to say thank you. That was just amazing. So many things in there. I could commentaries come flowing out of all you've said to provoke something. I think the Midrash thing is really appropriate to this because it comes from the Hebrew word darash, that means to pursue a bit deeper. And it's a big tradition in among Jewish people, among Jewish teachers, to go deeper. So it is. I think that retelling really is a Midrash. Any Jew hearing that would identify that as being commentary. There's 2 things actually that struck me. First of all, when you said your faith has saved you, the word that is used in the Greek, sesokense, it's from the word sozo. And of course, many of us are familiar through the work of Sozo here. That's more than just save. It's actually about healing. It's such a deep word. There's so many things attached to that. And there's so much going on in that woman, more than just a physical healing, as you brought out. It's this redemption almost. So when Jesus said faith has sesokense, it saved you, and it did at that moment. It was more than just a physical healing. And I think so often when God touches us, when he touches our lives, he does more than even just a physical touch. There's something going on in our whole being. And that's why it's interesting. The other thing just to say, I don't want to take too long, but when Jesus says to her, in the Greek he says, go is Irene, he says, go in peace. Irene, any of you called Irene, that's the Greek for peace. But of course he would have spoken Aramaic to her, or which is derived from Hebrew, which would be shalom. And shalom in Hebrew is that word that doesn't just mean peace. It actually means wholeness. It means completeness. And it just speaks to me when Jesus said to go in wholeness, that something in that moment had made her whole, had restored her. So it's just so encouraging. So thanks, Nicki, for that. It was really encouraging. It just sent me off in 100 different directions.
Thanks, Nicki. I think the thing that struck me was about how someone actually told the woman about Jesus and how they didn't see this outcast lady as an outcast, but just somebody to tell Jesus. And they didn't know what choice she'd make. They didn't know she would get healed. But somebody saw her and reached out to her.
Good morning. Nicki, thank you. Thank you so much. There's lots about this woman that I can't relate to. I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to live in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, but there is one aspect of her I can completely relate to, and it's a word you used a few times, Nicki, which is unclean. I sin every day with things that I think, with things that I say, with things that I do. I can relate to this lady's uncleanness and desire not to be that. And there's a beautiful thing that I've realized this morning where there's 2 people in this story, and one of them's unclean and one of them's clean. The lady's unclean and Jesus is clean. And when they come together, the unclean one doesn't make the clean one unclean. The clean one makes the unclean one clean. So when I draw close to Jesus and when I embrace the cross, I don't make him unclean. He makes me clean. This story is the gospel.
Thank you, Nicki. That was powerful, and bless you for speaking and journeying with Jesus that way. In the retelling of this story, what struck me actually to tears, I might cry as I'm speaking, was the movement from this woman just exhausting everything that she could to try and resolve her circumstance and her suffering. And then the moment where she goes, but there's this hope, that Jesus as hope as a person, and the redemption, and I just resonate so much with that when we come to him and we just see his hope and his redemption as so much stronger and more beautiful than the suffering and what's going on with us. Just experiencing him as the hope and redemption is just beautiful. And thank you, Nicki. It's just great.
Okay, two things are blowing me away, and it was great. I loved how and what you said. Thank you. All these millennia later, that woman is honored. All the people who judged her, and we may have been some of those people in our time, she's the one. And it's this business about, again, Christ. Christ saw and served and picked her up and elevated her for millennia. He knew he could say, you touched the hem of my prayer shawl or garment. But instead, he was making weight, the Jewish religious leader, it tells you this in the Gospels, of course, whose son was dying, daughter was dying, attends to this, elevates her, no judging. Your faith, what a woman, your faith has made you whole. They rush in, no time between the stories to say, you're wasting your time, no need to come, she's dead. And then he goes and attends. So he's really, really delivered the woman societally to I honor you, which I love as well.
Oh my God, hello? Okay. I just want to thank some of the people just mentioning, like, yes, like her being seen. I think that's so important because she would have been unseen and would have been just pushed aside. And I just think that's really powerful. And that Anne shared too, just like someone had to have brought that news of Jesus to her, which could have been a trivial thing. It could have been just maybe she overheard it in a market or something. But I think that really allowed her to take an action that changed her life, which is really cool.
I'd love to bring together a few of the things that I've heard different people say this morning. Because as I've been listening to this story, I have been thinking about the disciples and the crowd and how they wouldn't have been able to relate to her. They wouldn't know what it's like to be an outcast, because by definition, they were the in crowd. And they didn't know what it was like to bleed for that amount of time. They maybe didn't know what it was like to be a woman. They didn't know what it was like to be that old or whatever. But I find myself wondering how many of them also had things that they needed healing from that they were afraid to ask for. Or how many of them had things they were terrified that Jesus would see or say to them. And Jesus holds this woman up as an example to them. And Ashley was talking about mission and this sense of, the sense of somebody had to go and tell this woman. And I wonder if there are some of us here who have felt an invitation from God to bring good news to people that we feel like we can't relate to, that we feel like are different from us. But in this story, Jesus says, no, you can relate to them, but it's going to cost you. And it's going to cost you connecting with your own pain and your own brokenness and the darkness in your own heart, because that is where the connection's going to be. Because we all know what it's like to feel abandoned or alone or ashamed or forgotten or overlooked or all of these things. But it's so much easier to go out on mission with it all together and with all the answers and with our good Christian face on, going out that pain. But sometimes I think when we go out without doing that work of connection, we do more harm than good. And so I wonder whether this morning that is the invitation to some of us, that if you've heard that call to go and share good news with people, journey in to that, connecting with your own pain, because it'll be not only your healing, it'll be your mission. And those two things, I think, are inextricably linked.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for that, for drawing that together with us, for us so succinctly. That was really great. I get the sense that this story and this message, Nicki, has really touched us deeply this morning. And so I'd love to invite Abby and the band to come back. And we're actually going to spend a long time worshiping. And as we do so, I would just invite you just to really reflect further on, the question that Nicki, you gave us as to what is holding you back from what the Spirit is calling you into. How do you relate to this woman and your own reaction to that? So, it's going to be really nice just to have a long time to consider that together. So whenever you guys are ready, over to you.